There were masses of injured men. Most of them had been burnt, and there were men covered in oil. When I got to my life raft, I asked a sailor to come with me again and look for the people that were missing, including the commander.
Within 45 minutes, the Belgrano had sunk. Immediately, the entire Argentinian navy, fearful of further submarine attacks, turned round and headed home. The British had scored a huge military success, and Galtieri's plan seemed to be faltering. But he was still able to unleash the weapon the British feared most. The Argentinians had recently bought 5 air-launched exocets. These half-ton missiles could seek out and destroy a ship from over 30 miles away. On the morning of the 4th of May, 2 Argentinian strike aircraft, each armed with an exocet, took off from the mainland.
On that particular day in 1982, Woodward posted 3 ships like this as his front line of defense. They were destroyers: HMS Coventry, HMS Glasgow, and HMS Sheffield. They were armed with anti-aircraft missiles. These ships could shoot down aircraft, but they were unreliable against low-altitude targets like exocets.
That morning, things had been relatively quiet for the British task force.
This is Alpha Whiskey, weapons free, Baker 5017, a strength 2.
Then, just before 2 o'clock, the Argentinian aircraft were picked up by the radar room on board HMS Glasgow.
Strength 2 Falklands now exiting outside.
Glasgow immediately sent an urgent warning to all the other ships and went to full action stations herself.
Break! Break! Break!
Now going atop the ship.
Reminded the command aim remains coordinated at 5 full steady.
But 20 miles away, on board HMS Sheffield, the scene couldn't have been more different.
Here, the ops room wasn't fully manned, and only part of the message from the Glasgow was picked up. But it was worse than that. At that exact moment, HMS Sheffield was using its satellite equipment to send a message back to Britain, and that blocked its radar. The Sheffield couldn't see the Argentinian aircraft approaching.
Aircraft now returning inbound at red 100.
Back on the Glasgow, 2 fast-moving dots, possible exocet missiles, suddenly appeared on the radar screen and were closing in at 700 miles an hour. With a mixture of relief and horror, the captain of the Glasgow realized that the missiles were headed not for them, but straight for the Sheffield. HMS Sheffield was the first British ship to be destroyed by enemy action since the Second World War. Of the 281 men aboard, 20 were killed and 26 were wounded. Blood had now been shed on both sides of the conflict. By mid-May, the South Atlantic winter was closing in. Some Harriers had been lost in combat, and now the bad weather was beginning to hinder the pilots. The success of the British plan relied on having complete control of the air to provide cover for landing the ground troops. But the British didn't have that cover, and now time was running out. It was politically unthinkable to abandon the operation now. They would have to take the huge risk of putting in the ground troops without total air cover. On the 18th of May, The second wave of ships, including ferries and the cruise liner the Canberra, arrived just off the Falklands. On board was the amphibious landing force.
The 3,000 men were a mixture of Royal Marine commandos and Army paratroopers.
And they were led by Brigadier Julian Thompson. Thompson was an experienced commander. He knew that his troops were vulnerable without air superiority, but the pressure of time meant the landings had to go ahead.
The British had looked at all the landing site options on both West and East Falkland. Since Stanley over here was their ultimate target, it made sense to land here on East Falkland. They plumped for this natural harbour here at San Carlos Bay. It would be out of range of enemy artillery and was only very lightly defended. A great advantage for any amphibious landing. And here I am with San Carlos Bay behind me, and that's the entrance over there. That's where the British landing force came in. These hills also offered Thompson's men and ships some protection against low-level air attack. But there was one problem with this landing site. It was a long way from San Carlos here, across to the spot where Thompson knew the decisive battle would be fought, here in the strongly defended mountains just west of Stanley. Between the two was 50 miles of difficult country. Thompson planned to move his landing force right across the island with a shipment of helicopters that were due to arrive any day. But now, the priority was to get his men on dry land as soon as possible.
In the early hours of the 21st of May, 3,000 British troops headed for the landing beaches. Each man carried his rifle, ammunition, and enough rations for 2 days. This was the moment they'd been waiting for weeks. Once ashore, the British troops made their way up into the hills and dug themselves into strong positions. One unit, the 2nd Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, known as 2 Para, were based up here on the Sussex Mountains overlooking the bay. It was just a question of time before the Argentinians arrived. The men braced themselves for an air attack. Then, at 10:30, all hell broke loose.
The Argentinian High Command sent in wave after wave of their fighter bombers from the mainland. For 5 hours, these aircraft bombed and strafed the fleet sitting in the bay. The surrounding hills made it almost impossible for the ship's radars to detect the enemy aircraft, so the British were unable to get a fix on the attacking planes until it was too late.
From these positions up here, the Paras had a grandstand view of the action in the bay. All their supplies for the land campaign were still being unloaded from those ships coming under attack. The Paras had to watch helplessly as their lifeline was under fire.
By the end of the day, 5 British warships were hit, and one ship, HMS Ardent, was sinking.
And the attacks continued on the next day. The British had positioned anti-aircraft missiles around the bay, but it would be days before these delicate units were operational. On the water, the men had resorted to strapping machine guns onto the ship's rails in a desperate attempt to hit the low-flying Argentinian jets. More conventional anti-aircraft guns, some operated by sailors as young as 17, did score a few successes. But all these efforts did little to blunt the relentless onslaught of the Argentinian Air Force.
The British ships unloading vital supplies for the land campaign made easy targets. On May the 23rd, HMS Antelope, just out there, was the next vessel to take a fatal hit.